My name is Kristen Quinn, 28 years old. The words landed like a hammer on polished wood. All she's done is disappoint me. My father didn't have to shout. His voice had years of command in it, trained to project without effort. Every head in the community hall turned. The veterans in pressed khakis stopped mid-shuffle. Women stilled their fans. Children froze with lemonade cups hovering near their mouths. He stood tall, chest out, as if delivering an order on a parade ground. And in that moment, he used that authority not to discipline, not to inspire, but to humiliate me. The reunion had been billed as simple. Family, neighbors, old friends gathered in the town's community hall where bingo nights and fish fries usually filled the calendar. Folding chairs squeaked. The smell of fried chicken and brass polish hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of powdered lemonade. It wasn't grand, but it carried the familiarity of home. I had walked in with my head held high, not expecting warmth, but hoping at least for civility. It had been years since I'd stood in a room with my father, years since he'd looked at me with anything other than clipped dismissal. Yet here we were, forced to breathe the same air again. He spotted me the moment I entered. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a hard line. To a stranger, he might have looked like he was preparing to make a speech, but I knew better. He waited. He always knew how to let silence do the heavy lifting. He stood there until the chatter died down on its own, until the room was hushed enough to hear the tick of the ceiling fans. Then he detonated the words in the center of the room like a grenade. All she's done is disappoint me. The silence after was louder than any applause. It roared in my ears, burned across my cheeks. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to shout, to run, but my body locked. I stood there like a schoolgirl scolded before the principal, my hands curled into fists against my skirt, but I didn't flinch. Then, as if that weren't enough, my father shifted. He laid one broad, weathered hand on the shoulder of a man standing nearby. A man younger than him, but older than me, with broad shoulders, clean-cut hair, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who lived by discipline. "This," Dad announced, his voice swelling with pride, "this is a man who knows what service means." The hall responded with murmurs of admiration. Heads nodded, eyes darted to the stranger, reverence spreading through the crowd. "An elite member of the Navy SEALs," Dad continued, his voice thick with satisfaction. Respect radiated through the room, flowing toward the man beside him, away from me. My father's lips curved into something between a smirk and a victory grin, as if he had just proven a point no one else realized was being argued. "This is what I wanted," his expression said, not her. I should have swallowed the sting, let it pass, but my eyes locked with the SEALs. For a second, he wore the easy confidence of a man used to respect. Then, something shifted. His face paled, his jaw trembled, his expression cracked. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for every ear nearby, he said, "Are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" The words sliced through the room like a blade. A murmur spread instantly, rippling across the folding chairs. A veteran in the back stiffened. A young recruit swallowed hard, the title alone heavy enough to change the air. My father's smirk faltered, confusion flashing in his eyes. He didn't understand. He didn't know what this man knew. The name hung in the air like smoke, undeniable. Black Widow. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence filled in the truth for me. For a heartbeat, even my father seemed uncertain, his certainty cracking at the edges. He had spent years calling me a disappointment, blind to the reputation I'd built far from his sight, blind to the web I had spun in places he would never dare imagine. The room tilted, not in my favor, not yet, but away from him, away from his authority. For the first time that evening, he wasn't the sole master of the stage. The crowd's attention shifted, questions flaring in their eyes. What did that name mean? Why had a man trained in the harshest corners of the military looked at me with trembling recognition? I caught Remy's eyes, though I didn't know his name yet, and I saw the flicker of memory there, a mission. A night where the plan should have collapsed, but didn't. He wasn't looking at me like a stranger. He was looking at me like someone who had walked out of a rumor whispered in briefing rooms. My father didn't know those stories. He didn't understand the whispers that moved across bases like smoke. He had spent his life parading medals and commands, but he'd never learned to read the language of silence, of respect earned in the shadows. And as the crowd breathed in this sudden fracture of narrative, as the old veterans and young recruits recalibrated their image of me, I felt the ground shift. Not victory, not yet, but momentum. I could have seized it. I could have declared myself right there, lifted my chin, thrown every operation, every scar, every sleepless night into the room as evidence. But I didn't, because I knew this moment wasn't the culmination. It was only the opening crack. So I held steady. I let the silence work for me the way my father had always tried to use it against me. And inside, my thoughts spun backward, through years of training, of silence, of a childhood where standing straight mattered more than being loved. Through the mother who slipped poems into my lunchbox while my father demanded perfection. Through the night I applied to the Naval Academy in secret, determined to fight for the legacy he never believed I could carry. Because this moment, this hall, this trembling young SEAL, this father who didn't know me, hadn't started here. It had started long before, in a house where discipline was sharper than affection, where medals shone brighter than kindness, where every path I chose looked like betrayal in his eyes. It started the first time he looked at me and saw not a daughter, but the wrong answer to the question of legacy. And it began to shift the first time I decided I would not live under his script. That's the story I have to tell you. The story of how the Black Widow came to be. The kitchen smelled of black coffee and shoe polish. That was the fragrance of my childhood, bitter and sharp, the scent of discipline. I can still see the linoleum floor under my heels, my father pushing my shoulders back, telling me not to blink. A straight back tells the world you won't break. I was 8 years old, too young to understand the weight of words meant for soldiers, not daughters. But he insisted. My father had retired by then, yet retirement didn't soften him. It gave him more hours to perfect control. Every morning, 5:30 runs, shirts ironed to knife edges. Yes, sir. No, sir. Words spoken like oxygen. Our small town adored him. Parade speeches at the high school, a permanent seat at the Veterans Hall. People called him Sir at the grocery store. I called him Dad, but it always felt like borrowing a rank I hadn't earned. He believed legacies lived through sons. My mother believed in other inheritances. She slipped poems into my lunch bag. Frost, Hughes, Dickinson. Words folded like talismans against the iron weight of his expectations. She never argued with him. She let storms pass. Some weather only answers to time, she'd whisper when the house grew too quiet after one of his silences. At 12, he took me to an Army-Navy game. The stadium throbbed with brass bands and long-coated cadets. When Navy scored, I cheered. He didn't look at me. "Leave those colors to men who can pull their weight," he said, eyes locked on the field. I pretended I hadn't heard. Pretending would become practice. Saturday mornings were sacred for one purpose: the altar in our living room, a glass case where his medals gleamed, dusted weekly with a velvet brush. My job was the uniforms, learning the weight of the iron, the angle of the crease, the snap when it set correctly. "Precision is respect," he'd say. By the time I could handle long division, I could also identify every ribbon by color. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. He froze. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Then, flatly, without looking up from the mail, "You want attention, not service." His tone carried contempt. I insisted it was both. He set the letters down, one by one, like bricks in a wall between us. "You don't have the Constitution." He didn't mean stamina. He meant my sex. The house grew quieter after that. Dinner at 1800 sharp, dishes stacked just so, the news at 7, lights out at 10. When I aced chemistry, he muttered, When I won a track meet, he cautioned, "Don't get sloppy with your form." Silence was his punishment of choice. My mother resisted in subtle ways. One spring, she drove me to a recruiter's office, parking 2 blocks away so Dad's truck wouldn't pass and see us. While I filled out forms, she graded papers in the front seat. When I returned, she didn't ask what he'd say. She only asked, "What do you want most?" "A fair fight," I told her. She tapped the steering wheel and whispered, "Then train for unfair weather." Senior year, I mailed the application in secret. I wrote my essay at the kitchen table after midnight while the house breathed its rigid rhythm. I wrote about cadence at dawn, how order could open space inside someone always told she was too much. When the first envelope came, thin, cruelly polite, I hid it in a book. When the thick one arrived in March, I pressed it to my chest until the cold seeped through the paper. I waited until Dad was in his study, then knocked. He looked up, jaw set. I held out the envelope. "Sir," I said. He slid it open with his letter opener. His eyes flicked across the first line. "We are pleased to offer you admission." He stopped, folded the paper, slid it back across the desk. "So you're serious about this?" His voice was flat, stripped of everything but fatigue. I nodded. "We'll discuss it later," he said. We never did. On graduation night, he didn't come to the backyard party my mother strung with white lights and pitchers of lemonade. Friends asked if I was scared. Yes and no, I told them. Yes, of the water, no, of the choice. Around 9, I saw his car roll slowly past the curb without stopping. It felt like being saluted and dismissed in the same breath. The morning I left for plebe summer, my mother tucked 3 envelopes into my duffel. Open when you're lonely. Open when you're hurt. Open when you forget who you are. She hugged me at the bus station, then stepped back to inspect me the way she had before every first day of school. "Stand up straight," she said. We both laughed, but her eyes shimmered. My father had an appointment to get the tires rotated. On the bus, a boy with a buzz cut asked if I was nervous. "Nerves are a compass," I told him. "You just have to learn to read them." Out the window, the town slid away. Hardware store, diner, courthouse flag. Each landmark felt smaller, almost ornamental, as the road curved toward salt air. I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the chill settle my thoughts. I wasn't running away from him. I was running toward the only argument that made sense. Earn it. Processing smelled of cut grass, chlorine, and gun oil. Clippers snapped, clipboards shuffled. Last name, height, move. That night, I lay on a narrow rack and recited the general orders so I wouldn't count the miles home. I thought of linoleum floors in my father's hands, pushing my shoulders back. He had taught me to stand up straight. He never imagined I'd do it while facing him. At taps, I memorized the number, stenciled above my bunk, and whispered it like a prayer. I didn't know yet what the academy would demand, what names they'd try to pin on me, or which ones would stick. I only knew the silence I had grown up with had done enough talking. It was my turn. Annapolis didn't love you. It tested you. Plebe year shaved you down to the steel beneath the skin. I learned quickly that survival wasn't about being the loudest. It was about being exact. At dawn, breath-forming fog in the Chesapeake air, I ran until my chest burned and my legs steadied. Into metronomes. I folded exhaustion into my pocket and kept moving. The academy gave me what my father never intended, a way to measure myself without him. Commissioning day, I wore a uniform that still looked too big for my face. The orders they handed me pushed me close to the map's blurred edges, and I went, because that's what you do when you've trained for unfair weather. What I couldn't know then was that the silence I carried from home would find its echo in the halls of command, and in the web I would one day spin far from his gaze. The Pacific wind nearly knocked me sideways the first morning I set foot at Coronado. Sand filled everything, boots, teeth, even the corners of my eyes. The men around me lumbered with logs on their shoulders, moving like one organism, a machine of sweat and discipline. I wasn't there to become a SEAL. That door wasn't open to women. But I didn't argue with closed doors. I found the ones that creaked open and forced myself through. I was assigned as an operations and intel officer, paperwork to some, the spine of the mission to those who knew better. My task was to think faster than chaos, to write plans that could bend without breaking, to hear the hum of danger before it had a voice. At first, they called me ma'am, like it was a question. They looked at me as if I'd wandered onto the grinder by accident. I answered them with schedules that never slipped, comms that stayed clean, and briefs so precise even the chief who'd spent 20 years perfecting his scowl stopped tapping his pen. When they ran, I ran with them. When they swam, I dove in, salt stinging my throat. Respect doesn't arrive on command. It creeps in when men watch you shiver and stay anyway. I learned to shoot until the trigger press felt like a thought, not because I wanted to be one of them, but because I needed to be someone they couldn't afford to ignore. One training range in the desert taught me the true shape of my job, the heat bleached color from the world. Teams ran shoot house drills under the sun that never blinked. My role was to observe, to map the human angles, to notice where eyes went when stress spiked. I filled a field book with notes, the pages stiff with salt from sweat. Evenings, I sat on a tailgate with a map spread across my knees while the wind tried to tear it away. A chief leaned over once, squinting at the overlapping arcs I'd drawn around a target site. "You like webs?" he asked. His voice was half curiosity, half mockery. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The first time we went forward, the air stank of diesel and dust. Radios crackled like old men clearing their throats. My job was to hold the skeleton of the plan while the rest of them carried its muscle. There was a bomb maker we'd been tracking. His habits, his cigarettes, his favorite back door. We waited for Tuesday because the vendor he liked took longer to count change. That night, when the first truck stalled 2 blocks too soon, the plan should have collapsed, but I pivoted to Route C, what we called church, because it passed 3 of them. Timing slid forward 5 minutes. The man walked out the back exactly where I predicted. He reached for the phone he always used, but this time its tower was sleeping. He hesitated half a breath, and that was enough. No gunfire, no glory, just zip ties and silence. Back at the room, Hill, the same chief who'd once teased me, peeled off his gloves and looked at the arcs I'd drawn. "You spun that," he said, and he never saw the silk. The younger guys laughed, sketching a spider in the corner of my map with a Sharpie. A crude drawing, legs crooked, an hourglass bleeding red. The joke stuck. The name did too. At first I hated it. Black Widow. It sounded like death, like seduction, like something cheap. But over time, I realized it wasn't about body count. It was about webs, about the way I built plans that caught what ran, about the way I sensed when the air shifted, when a door opened wrong, when a voice on the net rose half a tone. Superstition grew. Men started knocking twice on my table before heading out, as if touching the map would guard their return. They weren't saluting me. They were saluting the web. But not every night cooperated. Once, a truck blew a tire on gravel we'd scouted twice. A helmet light failed at the worst corner. A stray dog barked at the wrong second. The plan nearly tore itself apart. "Hold 2, I whispered into the net, forcing calm into my voice. 3, window instead of door. 4, pivot now." They obeyed. They came back with what we needed. Every finger accounted for. I sat alone afterward, hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. Hill called it proof. She hears the web hum. Rumors traveled, faster than orders, faster than truth. I became a story told over bad coffee in rooms where boots lined the threshold. Some called me a spider. Others said I could see 2 steps ahead of chaos. I never called myself anything. I just kept spinning. Back home, my father never heard those rumors. He still lived 2 states away and 20 years behind. The town adored him. The diner kept his coffee hot. The post office clerk thanked him for his service. If someone mentioned my name, he changed the subject to weather or taxes. I mailed him once after a deployment, wrote that the water was colder than it looked in posters, that laughter was sometimes the only weapon we carried, that my work mattered even if no one pinned it to a board. I tucked in a photo, me at the pier, one hand on a case, salt whitening the fence. I signed it with love and waited. The letter came back unopened, but the name, Black Widow, kept following me. I never introduced myself that way, but others did, even visiting commanders. Once a colonel shook my hand and half smiled. "So you're the spider?" I shrugged. "I draw maps." He laughed. "Maps that make men feel safe inside them." It was the nicest thing anyone with stars on their collar had ever said to me. Still, for every compliment, there was a cost. Nights when silence roared louder than rotors. Nights when I cried in stairwells no one would ever record. Nights when I held my breath through a near miss that I couldn't explain in reports. The Black Widow was a rumor, a handle. But beneath it, I was still a daughter he'd dismissed as constitutionally unfit. The irony was almost cruel. My father taught me precision, posture, silence. Those same tools became the foundation of the life he could never recognize. And the story the young SEAL whispered in the hall years later, the one that cracked my father's certainty, began here. In a desert room with a flickering light, where radios hummed, where a crude spider was drawn in the margin of a map. Where I learned that webs don't need applause, they just need to hold. The room smelled of diesel and dust. Radios spat static, coughing like old men clearing their throats. Night lived in the corners, even at noon. We worked from a borrowed room, flickering strip light above us, table leaning sideways under the weight of maps and plans. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't meant to be. My job was to keep the skeleton of operations standing, even when its bones wanted to splinter. The bomb maker we hunted burned through lives like matches. We charted his habits with ruthless detail, where he ate, who lit his cigarettes, which door he trusted when he needed to vanish. Every line I drew on those maps was meant to corral chaos, to box it in until there was nowhere left to run. And when the Tuesday vendor slowed him down, when he reached for the phone whose tower we had silenced, the plan snapped shut. Not loudly, not with fireworks, quietly. That was how I worked. Quiet victories, the kind no one applauds, the kind no headlines capture. The men began to believe in the quiet. They started tapping their knuckles twice on my table before leaving, a ritual that felt half respect, half superstition. I didn't encourage it. I didn't stop it either. Sometimes rituals keep fear from chewing too loudly inside your chest. But quiet also carried cost. Loss doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It seeps in through the smallest cracks. A convoy delayed by a flat tire. A young man whose silence at dinner means more than words ever could. A breath caught too long on the radio. I learned to hear those fractures, to patch them with calm, to bear them when patching wasn't enough. One spring, a good man went silent and never came back from it. He'd been strong in every visible way, loud laughter, steady hands, but inside, storms had raged unchecked. I sat with his file until the letters blurred. Afterward, I fought for check-ins, questions about the air inside, not just the weather outside. At first, they mocked it, called it soft. But then, when another kid admitted he'd nearly drowned in silence, when my question gave him a language he didn't know he needed, they stopped mocking. They started knocking twice with more conviction. Ghost work, I began to call it. Work no one saw, no one pinned medals on. Work that saved men in ways reports never captured. Work that let other people become the story, so everyone else went home. At night, when adrenaline leaked out of the room and left us hollow, I'd sit with my maps. The lines bled together under my pen, a geometry of survival. Once, I caught myself drawing circles inside circles, arcs overlapping like a spider's lattice. I stared at it and realized I was sketching not just routes, but the shape of my own life. Layers of quiet, none meant to be noticed, all meant to hold. Back home, Dad never heard about any of it. He lived 2 states away, carrying on like my story had ended when I left. At the diner, they poured his coffee before he sat down. At church, they thanked him for his service with hands that trembled. If someone brought up my name, he pivoted to safe topics: weather, taxes, the price of gas. Mom was the bridge that kept from collapsing. Sunday evenings, she'd call from the kitchen phone. She never asked about operations. She asked small questions that opened doors without forcing me through them. Are you sleeping? Did you find something green to eat this week? Have you found a chapel nearby? I answered in half-truths. I'm fine. She spoke that dialect too. When I mailed Dad a photo after my promotion, bars glinting under fluorescent lights captioned, "You taught me to stand straight." It helps. It came back in a new envelope, the photo creased once down the middle. No note, just the fold. I tried not to read it as rejection. I failed. Once, between rotations, a chaplain I respected leaned close during chow and said, "You know you're ministering, right?" I laughed it off. "I'm managing risk," I said. He tilted his head. "Same job, different incense." The words stayed with me, unsettling and true. The irony haunted me. The rituals, the check-ins, the soft fail boxes, all the things that held men together were exactly the things my father had never offered me. He believed strength was forged in silence. I had learned strength was forged in asking. One evening, as dust thickened outside the compound walls, Hill set his gloves on my table and said, "We don't say it, but your maps save us." He tapped twice and walked out. I stared at the space his words left behind. That was ghost work too. the kind that doesn't echo but lingers like incense long after the smoke has cleared. Back home, my father still commanded the town's respect like oxygen. He wore his medals at parades, gave speeches that drew polite applause. People adored him. They didn't know he hadn't asked about his daughter in years. They didn't know his silence was armor worn so long it had fused to his skin. One Sunday, Mom slipped in a quiet confession. He keeps your picture in his study. My breath caught. Then why? I started, but she interrupted gently. Because care can look like custody. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. That night, under the thrum of the generator, I sat with a map and drew circles tighter and tighter until they bled into black. Somewhere in that blur was the truth. The world I was holding together overseas, and the one that was breaking apart back home. Silence was his discipline. Quiet had become my lifeline. The difference mattered. One broke, the other mended. But both cost something. And as I folded another checklist into my pocket, I couldn't shake the thought that someday those two silences, the one that built me and the one that sustained me, would collide. And when they did, something would break. Illness entered our lives quietly. My mother said the word biopsy as though she was spelling it out for a quiz. Soft and careful, like maybe if she kept her voice low, it wouldn't be real. When the diagnosis hardened into truth, my father informed me by email, 2 sentences, correctly punctuated, no emotion. I read it in a stairwell in Bahrain where the heat pressed against me like a wet shirt. I called immediately, desperate for detail. Mom answered. Don't come yet, she told me. Do your job, I'll do mine. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the fatigue weaving itself through the spaces between words. She had always been the quiet center of our house, the one who filled silence with poems and mercy. Now she was carrying a storm with no umbrella. When hospice finally called, I was already wheels up. Hill, across the aisle, caught my eyes and didn't ask questions. He just nodded, as if some losses didn't need explanation. By the time I reached her bedside, her hands were translucent, blue running through her veins like fragile glass. My father stood rigid at the window, arms crossed, guarding the parking lot as though his posture alone could keep grief from entering. He nodded at me once, nothing more. I sat beside her, reading poems she had once tucked into my lunch bag. Frost, then Mary Oliver, then whatever slim volumes the visitor library offered. She drifted in and out like tidewater, but when she surfaced, her eyes lit with the same mischief I'd known as a child. One morning she pressed 2 fingers to my sleeve and whispered, "Keep flying. Not away, just up." Then she slipped back into dreams. She died before sunrise. The room shifted in that instant. It wasn't only absence, it was gravity changing, air rearranging itself. I looked at my father, but he didn't meet my eyes. He just stapled the funeral program over and over again as if paper could become armor. At the funeral, he spoke first, his voice steady, words about duty and service and legacy. When it was my turn, I kept it plain. I spoke of her lemon-scented car in winter, the way she graded with pencil and mercy, how she could name birds by silhouette. It was my way of saying, she gave me a language he never taught. I scanned the crowd and noticed veterans shifting, neighbors listening, but my father kept his gaze fixed on the program in his lap. Stapling, always stapling. Afterward, back on base, I began adding a new box to every pre-mission checklist. Who calls home if it goes sideways? Names written like talismans. We carried each other's families as carefully as weapons. We made a habit of asking not just about readiness, but about air, the kind you breathe inside, not outside. That's when Remy entered the story. He was young, jaw tilted like it carried a question, eyes steady but untested. I watched him during drills, noticed the way he always aimed low with his gaze, as though afraid to measure himself against anyone else. Yet in the field, his instincts cut sharper than he realized. One night, a plan buckled. A truck died early. A door opened wrong. Men hesitated, looking for the crack in the web. I whispered the pivot, kept the timing clean. They made it back with everything intact. After, Remy came to me quietly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely more than gravel. "Did you see that coming?" I looked at him. I saw what could. He nodded, like a man who had just learned there are different kinds of sight. From then on, he knocked twice on my table with the others. Not out of superstition, but respect. Loss, though, didn't stop testing us. Another spring, another man went quiet, not in death, but in life. His laughter vanished, his eyes dull. This time, because of the check-ins I insisted on, we caught him before he slipped too far. He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. He showed up to the next drill, breathing. That was thanks enough. The cost of quiet work is that it rarely announces itself. My father would never know about these rescues, never measure them the way he measured medals. But the men knew, and slowly I realized I had a family stitched together not by blood, but by chosen accountability. On leave, I went home once. The house smelled of lemon polish, but emptier without Mom's poems tucked into corners. Dad sat on the porch, cleaning a rifle that didn't need it. He asked about the weather. He asked if I'd changed the oil in my car. He never asked what I did. I didn't tell him. Inside, her books still lined the shelves. I pulled one down, Dickinson, and a folded scrap of paper fluttered out, in her handwriting. Storms break branches. They also water roots. I tucked it into my pocket. That night, alone in my room, I wondered if her words were meant for me or for him. Maybe both. When I returned to base, the team gathered for a brief. Remy caught my eye, gave a subtle nod, and tapped twice on the table. The ritual spread like wildfire, quiet but insistent. Even the skeptics knocked now. It hit me then. The past had taken a knee, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. My father would never see it. But in the field, among men who had learned to trust the web, respect had already shifted. And yet, some part of me still craved that respect from the man who stapled programs instead of speaking. The paradox ached. I could carry men through fire, but I couldn't get my father to ask me one honest question. I knew then that our reckoning would come. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be cinematic. It would arrive like my mother's whisper, soft, insistent, impossible to ignore. Reforms rarely begin with speeches. They begin with scribbles in the margins, with someone saying, "What if we did it this way?" I started rewriting our training modules after nights when the plans bent so hard I could still feel the ache in my ribs days later. At first, the old guard resisted. They called it overthinking. They said tradition already knew best. But metrics don't lie. And when fewer men limped back with near misses, when fewer surprises turned catastrophic, they stopped mocking and started listening. I framed it simply. Respect is a logistics problem. Plan for it, and you prevent ruin. Ignore it, and you inherit chaos. When command asked me to brief a group of officers, I showed up with one slide. Just 5 words. Respect is a logistics problem. They chuckled at first, but then I unpacked it. How dignity isn't sentimental, it's structural. How when you account for human weather, you save equipment, morale, and lives. The room grew still. Some scribbled notes, others just sat heavier in their chairs, processing. The reforms spread slowly but stuck. Stress inoculation drills that weren't about breaking bodies but training minds to recognize their own storms. After-action debriefs that asked, "How's your air?" instead of just, "What went wrong?" We even created a checklist called After the After, a guide for the week after adrenaline drained, when silence can suffocate. Hill started teasing me less, his scowl softening into something like respect. Torres, who had once sneered at my mental health check-ins, began running them with a voice so steady it calmed the new recruits before they even spoke. But with recognition came attention I hadn't asked for. The nickname leaked past our circle, whispered in rooms I had never entered. Black Widow. A colonel once introduced me at a briefing as the one who hears the web hum. I resisted rolling my eyes, but the words lingered. With notoriety came distance. Dating civilians never worked. They wanted weekends that felt like promises, trips that looked like postcards. I talked about Tuesday flights, rehearsals in the rain, stress drills that looked like punishment but felt like lifelines. Most looked at my hands and saw steel where I wanted them to see steadiness. They wanted me safe, smaller. I had spent too long refusing to be smaller. Back home, silence thickened. My father sent me a single envelope one winter. Inside was a clipped newspaper article, my name absent, but the program I'd helped design mentioned as a model for reducing casualties. On the margin, in his precise handwriting, "They're making you a symbol." 5 words. I stared at them for a long time. To him, it sounded like a dismissal, a label, tidy enough to file away. But to me, it was another wall. Symbols don't laugh with men before bad nights. Symbols don't memorize the tremor in a soldier's voice before he breaks. Symbols don't sit on stairwells after funerals, holding files until the letters blur. He thought he was telling me I'd been turned into something larger than life. What I heard was that he would never see the life inside it. I didn't reply. A month later, a mutual friend from their church wrote me a letter. Her cursive curved across the page. He keeps your picture in his study. He doesn't talk about it. I read the line again and again until the words dulled. Care can look like custody. Love can disguise itself as silence. But silence still weighed heavy. Meanwhile, my chosen family thickened. Remy kept growing, shoulders squaring into responsibility. He briefed missions with a stammer at first, then with growing confidence. I pushed him hard, forcing him to fail, then to rebuild. You're not a gun with legs, I told him once. You're a man with a brain that brings people home. He carried those words like scripture. One spring, after another successful rotation, command invited me back to speak. This time I brought no slides at all. I just told them a story about a night when a helmet light failed, when a truck blew a tire, when a stray dog barked at the worst moment, and how the team survived because we had planned for dignity, not perfection. The room went silent in a different way, not dismissive, reverent. They realized respect wasn't an abstract value. It was the grease in the gears, the unseen force that held the whole machine together. But attention cast long shadows. At home, whispers reached my father before I did. Someone at the diner mentioned my name, coupled with that nickname. He chuckled, dismissive, said I filed papers, not missions. He didn't know that men had drawn spiders on maps because of me, that they had tapped twice on my table like it was an altar. He didn't want to know. And yet sometimes late at night, I wondered if the photo really did sit in his study, if he looked at it when no one else was watching, trying to reconcile the daughter he dismissed with the rumor she'd become. Respect is a logistics problem. I could plan it for platoons, for rooms full of officers, for entire rotations. But I had no plan for him. And in the silence between us, I began to suspect that one day the logistics of respect would demand a reckoning. The mission was codenamed Alcar, though no one remembered what the letters stood for. Acronyms are like bones. You don't think about them unless they break. But Alcar became the night the nickname stopped being a joke and started being scripture. It began with dust. The desert always started that way. Fine powder that seeped into your boots, your lungs, even the creases of folded maps. Radios hissed, restless. Engines coughed. The plan was clean on paper, rehearsed until every man could trace it blind. But the truth is, plans are fragile things. The desert knows this. The convoy rolled out under a sky too wide to trust. I sat at the command table with a grease pencil, lines arcing across the map. My voice crackled into the net, calm but clipped. Move to, eyes left. Watch for the vendor cart. It should have been simple, routine even, but simple never lasts. The first crack came with a truck tire, blown on gravel we'd scouted twice. The lead vehicle jerked sideways, dust swallowing its silhouette. Voices spiked on the net. Hold, push, fear has a sound, high-pitched and thin. Route C, I whispered. My voice had to be a metronome, steady enough to slow their pulse. Church Street, shift 5 forward. Engines groaned, gears spat. The convoy flexed like a wounded animal, but didn't break. Then the helmet light failed. A beam sputtered out just as they reached the corner. Darkness thickened and men froze. A breath too long, a silence too sharp, and the whole thing could have unraveled. Window, not door, I said. The words landed like compass points. I pictured their hands gripping weapons slick with sweat, the tremor in shoulders they couldn't admit to. And then, the dog. A stray, ribs like shadows, barking at the exact wrong second. The sound ricocheted through the alley. I felt the web vibrate, every line in danger of snapping. Pivot 4, your lead now, I ordered. Calm, not because I was, but because I couldn't afford not to be. Seconds stretched thin. Radios crackled. Then the bomb maker appeared, stepping out the back as if he'd rehearsed it with us. He reached for the phone, but its tower was already asleep. He hesitated, half a breath, no more. That was enough. No shots, no fire, just hands behind his head, zip ties, and silence. Back at the room, the air smelled of adrenaline and old coffee. Men peeled off gloves with hands that shook, though no one admitted it. Hill leaned over my map. His eyes traced the arcs I'd drawn, the contingency routes no one had believed we'd need. He tapped the paper twice. "You spun that," he said, and he never saw the silk. Someone grabbed a Sharpie, sketching another crude spider in the corner. Legs bent, red hourglass bleeding through. They laughed, tired and raw. The name, Black Widow, stuck harder than ever. I hated it, and I needed it. Because I knew, even then, that names carry weight, even the ones you don't claim. But Alcar didn't end when we packed up. The after-action review came days later, in a tent that stank of sweat and diesel. A senior officer leaned across the table, eyes sharp. "Why did you deviate from protocol?" His voice was clipped, impatient. He wanted me to justify improvisation when the manuals demanded obedience. "Because protocol doesn't account for stray dogs," I said flatly. The room chuckled. He didn't. His gaze tightened, pride pricked. "You were lucky." Hill cleared his throat, stepping in. "With respect, sir, it wasn't luck. It was her web." The officer's jaw worked. He wanted credit distributed differently. He wanted the success chalked up to brute force, not the quiet calculus of a woman with a pencil. He didn't get his way, but his resentment lodged in the air like smoke. Later, I overheard him mutter to another commander, "She's dangerous, not because of what she does, because of what they believe she does." It chilled me. Not because it was untrue, but because belief carries power, and power always unsettles someone who thinks it's theirs by default. That night, I sat alone with my maps. I traced the arcs again, replaying the mission until my hands cramped. My pencil snapped, graphite streaking my palm. I thought of my father then, how he worshipped structure, metals, the clean lines of legacy. He would have said luck too. He would have said stray dogs shouldn't decide outcomes. He never understood that survival often depended on the cracks, on knowing how to pivot when perfection shattered. I folded the map and kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Webs aren't about control. They're about sensing vibration, adapting before collapse. The rumor of Alcar spread faster than the report. Men rotated out and carried it to new bases, new chow halls. "She hears the web hum. She saved us from a stray dog." Stories warped, exaggerated, but always circled back to the same truth. We had all come home that night. Remy, still green then, carried it deepest. I caught him weeks later, his jaw set different, eyes sharper. He knocked twice on my table and whispered, "You fixed the angle. I still send my mother a card in May because of that night." I didn't respond. Ghost work doesn't belong to one throat, but inside, something shifted. Respect had rooted itself in places protocol never could. Alcar was proof. Proof that webs catch what runs. Proof that belief, once seated, is stronger than doubt. And proof that someday, when my father heard the name he thought was just a joke, he'd realize the silence he used to discipline me had been weaponized into something he could never claim. But that day hadn't come yet. For now, the mission was over, the maps folded, the spider drawn in crude ink. And the hum in the lines still kept me awake at night. The hall smelled of fried chicken and brass polish, same as always. Folding chairs squeaked, ceiling fans spun, paper programs fluttered in the hands of women fanning themselves. My father's voice had just filled the room with condemnation. "All she's done is disappoint me." And then Remy's tremor had cracked the air. "Are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" What followed was not silence, it was recalibration. Every face in the room shifted like chess pieces being reconsidered. Veterans who had sat with backs straight from my father's speeches leaned forward now, curiosity burning in their eyes. A boy of 12 whispered to his dad, "She's really real," as if I had stepped out of some legend. Even Mrs. Dwyer, the elementary school receptionist who'd bandaged playground knees for decades, froze with her hand on the microphone, then quietly set it down. She understood the room needed no translation. My father tried to recover. He clapped Remy's shoulder, chuckled like it was all a misunderstanding. "Some nickname," he scoffed. "My daughter files papers, spreadsheets, nothing more." But the line that once would have earned polite laughter landed flat. No chuckles, no sympathetic coughs, just the weight of truth pressing down on wood floors. Remy's jaw tightened, his voice steadied, louder this time. "With respect, sir, she doesn't file. She spins the web that keeps us breathing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The veterans shifted in their seats. The younger recruits swallowed hard, understanding what it meant when a man like Remy put reverence in his voice. A retired officer near the back leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice carried across the hush. Widow's checklists. I've seen the memo. That wasn't paperwork. That was survival doctrine. My father stiffened, caught off guard by the recognition from someone he respected. His jaw twitched. He tried again, hands out like a showman grasping for humor. Well, I'm sure she's very good at her spreadsheets. But still, the room refused to laugh. A cousin I barely knew, one who had my mother's eyebrows, spoke up. Her voice was tentative but clear. Uncle Frank, maybe you don't know everything she is. It hit harder than any insult. Silence can wound, but this silence healed. The pause that followed was full, not empty, full of people rearranging their understanding of who commanded respect here. I moved then, just half a step, enough to see the flag by the stage and the reflection of us all in the glass of the trophy case. It's just a name, I said softly. Names are lighter than work. The veterans nodded. They knew. A man in a ball cap, Vietnam vet, rose slowly, placed his hand over his heart. Then another stood. Then a woman with a bun tight against her head, jaw clenched, like someone who had been her own witness for too long. Remy straightened beside my father, as if answering an invisible roll call. No one called Admiral on deck. This wasn't ceremony. It was instinct. My father's eyes darted from face to face. Annoyance, then calculation, then something else flickered there. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of revision. The past is jealous. It hates edits. And this room was editing him in real time. For the first time in years, he looked small inside his jacket. I didn't list missions. I didn't boast. I didn't rescue him with anecdotes that would soften the blow. I simply said one true thing. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. Sometimes in rooms where no one can see. Sometimes right here. The words sat heavy. Furniture rearranged in the hall. A boy whispered again, louder now. She's really real. His father squeezed his shoulder. Looks that way. Mrs. Dwyer tried the microphone again. It squealed, then settled. She cleared her throat, diplomatic as ever. Why don't we take a minute? Coffee's hot, cake's on the table, and afterward, if anyone wants to share words for those serving, we can do that. The spell broke, but not in retreat. People rose, moving toward coffee, toward cake, but glances kept flicking back to me. Curiosity, apology, pride, even awe. I poured a cup I didn't want, just to keep my hands busy. A man I'd mowed lawns with at 14 came over, eyes wide. We're proud of you, he said. Did you know Artina joined the Air Force? My brother served too. He would have liked you. Their words weren't about me so much as about themselves, but I accepted them like medals, placed gently where the giver needed them. When I turned back, my father was closer. Not close, just closer. His eyes scanned my face with the same concentration that once preceded a lecture. He looked like a man trying to read a map that had added roads while he slept. Behind him, Remy stood steady. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. He leaned close enough to murmur, I didn't mean to make a scene. You didn't, I answered. You made it honest. His jaw worked, unlocking emotions he hadn't rehearsed. He glanced at my father. He didn't know. He didn't want to, I said. There's a difference. Dad hovered near the stage, hands clasped behind his back, a man inspecting a field that had sprouted rocks overnight. People gave him space, respect for what he had been, irritation for what he was being. He stared at the flag and didn't salute. For the first time in my life, the room wasn't orbiting him. It was orbiting me. Not out of vanity, but out of gravity, the kind that shifts when truth finds its center. That night, the oak floor of the community hall made a sound I'll never forget. It was the sound of respect putting its weight down. And though the evening ended with coffee and cake and murmurs, nothing returned to its old measure. The town had stood. My father hadn't. Not yet. The morning after the hall, I drove the long way through town, past the high school bleachers that hadn't seen paint in years, past the diner where pies sat in the window like promises, past the courthouse flag that always seemed too big for the pole. The town looked the same, but it wasn't. Once a room shifts, the world outside carries the echo. I ended up in front of the house I had sworn never to return to. The paint was peeling from the porch rails, the gutters sagging just enough to suggest neglect. My father's truck sat in the driveway, polished but old, like him. I climbed the steps, palms slick. When he opened the door, his mouth was already forming a sentence, but it stalled. For the first time in years, he looked older than his posture. He stepped back and said the word he always used when words failed him. Coffee? I nodded. Mercy can sound like agreement. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table that had weathered every battle we'd fought. His hands wrapped around the mug, like it carried field heat. Mine rested open on the wood, empty, visible. I didn't know, he said finally. 4 words, heavy as any metal. I didn't tell you, I countered. Then softer, I couldn't, and you didn't ask. He flinched at that, though he tried to hide it. His eyes moved to the bubbled spot on the table varnish, a scar from the night I'd set a pot down too hot. He touched it absent-mindedly, the way people touch old wounds. I wanted, he began, then stopped. I expected... He stopped again, the sentence a bridge with missing planks. Finally, I didn't know the language there. It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. Not absolution, not apology, just truth. You don't have to speak it, I said. You just have to stop correcting my accent. A laugh came from someone outside the window, a neighbor passing by. Not unkind, just ordinary. Dad didn't laugh, but his shoulders dropped a fraction, the way men lower their rifles when they realize the fight has already ended. We talked then, not about missions or medals, but about air. About the kind inside old men, heavy with silence. About loss that arrives first, like absence, then like furniture you bump into in the dark. I told him Mom's last words, because they belonged to both of us. Keep flying. Not away, just up. He looked away for 3 full minutes, the kitchen clock marking each one. When he turned back, his voice had changed key. If I came to something, he said, making a vague gesture that could have meant church, a meeting, even just a town hall. Would there be a seat? There's always a seat, I told him. You choose where to put your hands. His gaze lingered on the doorway as if imagining himself walking through it, not as a commander, not as a symbol, just as a man trying to learn a new posture. I didn't wait for braver words. The plan was simple. Leave without slamming. Return without requirement. I stood, rinsed my mug, set it upside down to dry. At the threshold, he cleared his throat. Proud, he said. 1 word, bare. Then quieter, almost a confession. Even when I didn't know how. I didn't cry. I just nodded. Do the knowing now. Outside, the air was bright. The sky impossibly ordinary. I walked down the steps lighter than when I'd climbed them. Not because we were fixed. We weren't. But because something had shifted. Back at base, the world kept moving. Emails waited, missions queued. A chaplain wrote to say the town was talking with a kinder voice that week. A mother I'd met once at a pinning ceremony sent a note. My boy said you make rooms taller. Thank you for letting him be tall. I typed back. He stood himself. I just moved the chairs. Respect is a logistics problem. And in that kitchen, over coffee and silence, we had finally drafted a plan. Not perfect, not finished, but a plan nonetheless. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was an armistice. And sometimes that's enough to keep flying. Respect travels in strange currencies. For me, it arrived in letters, not medals. Some typed in block capitals, some scribbled in shaky hands from men who had outlived their squads. A young officer wrote once, asking how to lead when a room resented her pronouns. I told her, show your math, share your credit, knock twice before you enter any soul. She taped those words inside her locker beside a photo of her mother holding a wrench. Remy came through base one afternoon, older now, jaw less tilted, steadier. He brought pecan pie from his mother and looked uncomfortable in my office. Too tidy, he joked. You'd hate my garage. We sat on crates instead of chairs because chairs lie about power. He asked if he'd done right in that hall. You told the truth, I said. Truth stands fine without a witness, but some nights it appreciates the company. He nodded, then knocked twice on the door frame before leaving, borrowing luck he meant to return. Weeks later, an envelope arrived from home. My father's precise hand on the address. Inside, a clipping from the local paper. A paragraph about the reunion. A single line. The community stood to honor service. Beneath it, his handwriting. I should have stood sooner. 5 words. Oddly familiar. I pinned them on the wall above my desk, beside a county map that didn't need mapping. They made the room different. The Navy invited me to brief a new working group on training reforms. I stood in front of a room full of uniforms, my single slide projected behind me. Respect is a logistics problem. They leaned forward, listening. Some skeptical, some curious, some grateful. I told them about dignity as a structural safeguard, about planning for silence as carefully as for gunfire. Afterward, letters trickled in. A colonel I didn't know wrote, "I hear you make rooms safer." I pinned that one too. Not as pride, but as reminder. At Christmas, my desk filled with cards. Men who never wrote cards before scribbled thanks. "Ma'am, your web kept me breathing this year." I read them alone, quiet as any prayer. But ghost work never ends. Nights grew long. Missions bent, sometimes broke. Loss arrived, not always in death, but in fractures no one else could see. I learned to hold truths without expecting anyone to salute them. On leave, I visited my mother's grave. Grass had grown back, even where grief had scuffed it bare. I pressed my palm to the stone, words catching in my throat. "We're learning," I whispered. "Slow, but right." The wind moved through the oaks, patient as old women quilting. I took it as an answer. Love found me unexpectedly. Not in civilians who wanted me smaller, but in someone who understood that space is something you make, not take. A man who didn't flinch at my scars, who didn't ask me to soften my edges, who knew webs aren't cages, they're safety nets. But that's another story. The Black Widow name still followed me, but I stopped fighting it. A nickname is just a handle. What matters is what you lift with it. And I had learned to lift men through storms, to lift silence into language, to lift a town out of its inherited blindness. One winter, I received a final envelope from my father. Inside was no clipping, no judgment, just a photograph of a national park, the kind with carved bears outside the gift shop. On the back, his handwriting. "There's a seat if you want it." I didn't rush to answer. Some storms only answer to time, but I pinned it on the wall beside the others. Because sometimes armistice is enough, sometimes 5 words are enough, sometimes standing straight is enough. I will always remember the sound the oak floor made that night in the hall when respect put its weight down. Louder than applause, more lasting than medals. Blood didn't salute that night, honor did. And it still does, if we let it.